Please keep watching, this is a serious video essay.
Phylogenetics. It's one of those branches of science that no one really studies in high school or hears about at all, until it comes up with something stupid or ridiculous, and then all of a sudden everyone is having discourse on Twitter about science being completely disconnected from the real world because whales are basically cows, apparently. It is so strange and abstract in an amusing sort of way that the creators of QI, British comedy trivia show, named their spin-off podcast There is No Such Thing as a Fish, which is indeed true. Other phylogenetic insights, such as termites are actually cockroaches and mammals are technically reptiles, come up on television and social media from time to time, primarily for clickbait and comic relief. Of course, it's nothing new for science to be perceived as strange or ridiculous by the general public. Quantum physics, for example, attracts way more attention, which probably drives physicists mad.
We know what's in the on of the universe, it's energy and information. We use it in our technology when we use cell phones or surf the information highway on the internet to send each other emails.
What? Okay, wait a second.
However, the difference between something like quantum physics or advanced mathematical analysis and phylogenetics is that the former study abstract, inaccessible and complicated systems that the general public has no intuitions about. Phylogenetics sorts plants and animals into groups. The disconnect between natural intuitive perceptions such as that a chicken is very different from a T-Rex, or that fishes obviously exist, and the realities of current scientific understanding is what makes the difference. And because of this disconnect, to a non-expert audience, both the methods and the actual purpose of drawing these bizarre phylogenetic trees is far from clear. Also, it's not like people who study this stuff never disagree with each other. I remember hearing from my professors as an undergrad that they have to update their PowerPoints non-stop, because every fucking year a new molecular genetics paper comes out and reshuffles the entire tree and makes every single textbook in the library incorrect. Modern molecular tools and computers have revolutionized biology in the recent years and made it both much faster and easier, and somehow even more confusing. I would know, I sit in front of a computer all day writing code in R. It's for decoration, I just look sexy in it. So anyway, recently I had to go through a bunch of phylogenetic papers for my current research, and it sent me down a rabbit hole of questions about it, such as, why is this branch of science so controversial? Why does it exist, and what sort of purpose does it serve in biology? Does it even count as a traditional methodological science? And because I have a YouTube channel, I've decided to make this your problem. Enjoy.
Part 1, the pre-20th century history.
When you think about it, there aren't a lot of things as quintessentially human as sorting. One of the first things tiny children learn to do is categorize things by color, shape and purpose, and almost every school subject has some sort of cataloging system in it. Language has vowels and consonants, nouns and verbs, objects and subjects. Mathematics distinguishes between numbers that are natural, rational and irrational. And other school children are fantastic at categorizing you as either worthy of basic respect and human rights or not. Politicians do this also. Humans also love categorizing ourselves. We do online personality quizzes and remember our star signs and get attached to our labels, such as religious or political affiliations, sometimes to the point of them becoming a part of our identity. From the point of view of evolution, systematizing serves two purposes. First is gathering information about the world that helps you survive, such as which mushrooms are edible and which are only edible once, and the second is maintaining a social structure, such as knowing the difference between your tribe and the enemy tribe. So it's really no surprise that we've been cataloging plants and animals for as long as we've had language and culture. Really, when you think about it, just naming is already categorizing. When we agree on what we call a tiger and what we call a mushroom, we're necessarily setting definitions on what counts as a tiger and what counts as a mushroom. Of course, at that point, the categories were either purely practical or maybe spiritual, and didn't need to have any sort of internal logic to them, as long as they served their purpose. Basically, there is a difference between deciding what counts as a tiger and arguing about whether a tiger is more like a wolf or more like a bear. One of the first people we know of that decided to tackle this question systematically were the ancient Greeks. Ancient Greece is the birthplace of European philosophy, which itself was largely inspired by Egyptian and Arabic philosophy, and for the most part was batshit crazy. Like, this is the time of people such as Pliny the Elder who thought that "I heard it in a tavern" or I don't know, just sounds cool, were acceptable sources for claims. This was the Wild West of human ideas, a kind of pre-technological Twitter where everything was allowed. There isn't much that survived to these days apart from the understanding that living and non-living matter are very different from each other and that animals can be distinguished from all other living things by their intentional movement. And yes, I know that you can make an argument that plants are also capable of intentional movement, but this is the thing that we will come back to again and again, which is there is no such thing as a biological rule with no exceptions. Later categories of plants and animals remain largely practical, existing for the purposes of farming, agriculture, medicine, and ritual or witchcraft. It wasn't until pre-biology, pre-science forms of study, such as natural philosophy, that we start to see attempts to categorize organisms that were really of no use to humans, just for the sake of curiosity. Pre-scientific method, we already start to see albums and records of various plants and animals, complete with Latin names, especially from the beginning of Europeans traveling to other parts of the world. In a way, this was a return to the natural curiosity of a hunter-gatherer that took notice of their whole environment, except it was now exceeding the capacity of a single human's memory, so some system of categorization was desperately needed. This was obvious to a young man by the name of Carl, who started by naming himself Linnaeus, and got so addicted to naming stuff that he dedicated the rest of his life to it. See, in the times when Linnaeus was getting his vaguely biological education, naming conventions of plants and animals were absolutely ridiculous.
Formal name of a tomato plant was Solanum caule inerme herbaceofolus pinnatus incisus racemus simplicibus.
Adjectives were piled on top of each other till you would end up with a name that was a paragraph long. So, like the absolute chad that he was, Linnaeus decided to cut it down to just two words, a binominal nomenclature. Genus name and species name like Homo sapiens or Arabidopsis thaliana, and expanded upwards from there. Now the system started making sense, because at the bottom of it you had the species, which were grouped into genuses, which were then grouped into families and orders and phyla and so on. And instead of a huge horizontal plane with hundreds of species piled in vague circles, you had a branching tree that could be followed either bottom up or top down. And this is a biological categorization that automatically implies some sort of relation, like a family tree that includes all of your ancestors 5 generations back. Now we're onto something. Up until the end of the 19th century, European biology as a whole largely functioned under the assumption of the natural world being static, unchanging, and created perfectly by our Lord and Savior Flying Cheese Cube some 5,000 years ago. Linnaeus himself had no beef with Christianity and considered himself God's special boy. God created Linnaeus, named and all that. He also viewed the natural world as a hierarchy, going from less developed to more developed, with humans at the top as the perfect pinnacle of creation. No prominent natural philosopher in Europe was even considering the possibility that humans being starkly similar to monkeys implied an actual relation. Nevertheless, by the first half of the 19th century, some natural philosophers like Lamarck and Buffon were already starting to question this perfect and unchanging vision of nature. But it wasn't until the theory of evolution of natural selection that this became a mainstream opinion. Enter two other absolute chads, Darwin and Wallace. Using similar sources but working independently, they came up with the same explanation for the diversity of life on Earth, a process in which organisms slowly changed and split into different groups selected by their environment in the same way that humans select animals during artificial breeding. As an evolutionary biologist, I'm very biased, but damn, evolution is such an elegant theory. The basic premises of it are stupidly simple, but you end up explaining every adaptation and every ridiculous fuck-up of a trait you can find in the natural world. The thing is though, we now know something that neither Darwin or Wallace did. Genetics. Mutation and genetic heritability were the one crucial element missing from the evolutionary theory when it first entered the scene. This led to, at the time, entirely justified criticism, and it is something Darwin himself struggled with till the end of his life. Unbeknownst to him and Wallace, far away in a Christian monastery, a Czech monk by the name of Gregor Mendel has cracked the most basic principles of inheritance. The two essential components of the modern evolutionary synthesis, natural selection and genetics, were star-crossed lovers that would not meet for several more decades. The idea of living organisms being related was still very compelling though, especially considering that we started discovering and describing fossilized remains of extinct animals. It made sense now that, though relying only on obvious and visible characteristics, taxonomy was reflecting some sort of historical evolutionary record of relatedness. The basis of modern phylogenetics was set. Instead of cataloging living things in the way a collection manager in a museum does, we could start putting some sort of internal sense into the system. And fucking hell we did, we went at it hard.
Part 2, yet another epic beef among scientists.
When I first started researching this video, I was planning for it to be mostly about the philosophy of science and categorization, but then I got into obscure taxonomy drama, and now I have to do something with this knowledge because it is wild. Too long didn't read, I've spent too much time reading obscure scientific papers, and I'm about to make it everyone else's problem. So, the thing about early 20th century science is that it was, for the most part, well transitioned out of the times of purely descriptive, soft, and often opinion-based practices. Exact and most natural sciences really wanted to distinguish themselves from philosophy by sticking to the scientific method and using mathematics whenever possible. Meanwhile, biology, especially evolutionary biology, was still kind of lagging behind in that respect. It was often criticized for being too vague, impartial, and overly reliant on people's subjective judgments. For evolutionary biology, the way out of this was twofold. First was the rediscovery of Mendel's work, as well as subsequent discoveries such as the role of cell nucleus and DNA, which led to the creation of the so-called modern synthesis. Second was the application of a new field of mathematics, statistics, which was advanced in large part by geneticists and for geneticists. It was also invented for eugenics, but we don't have time to unpack all of that. Genetics and statistics allowed evolutionary biology to join the ranks of hard methodological sciences, though it is still not uncommon for evolutionary biology to be considered a softer science. This transition affected every aspect of biology, including the classification of living organisms. Now, instead of creating a mostly arbitrary system, we needed some sort of solid ground for systematics. An obvious choice was evolutionary relationships, drawing trees of life as actual genealogical trees that try as accurately as possible to represent which group descended from which. By accident, pre-evolutionary biology systems were already following this pattern to some extent. People who were making them were using the tiniest traits that pointed to similarities, and often enough similarity is a sign of relatedness. Of course, the issue with this is that A, there's plenty of traits that are similar between groups by pure accident, because convergent or parallel evolution, and B, very few animals fossilize well, so many evolutionary transitions appear to us in steps, jumps and leaps, while we keep searching for the missing links. This makes determination of relatedness based on morphology of currently extant animals pretty damn tricky. The drawing of trees based on presumed evolutionary relation is called phylogenetics, and it did have its opponents. For example, numerical taxonomists, aka phreneticists, reasoned that the true evolutionary relationship of currently living organisms is unknowable, and therefore it makes no sense to try to guess it. Instead, they focused on old-school methods of categorizing based on the most parsimonious explanation of similarity, and on developing new mathematical methods for constructing these trees. Yet another group sided with phylogenetics more than with the phreneticists, but also established some hard rules for categorization which would ensure getting it as close as possible to the real story. The rules were 1. The use of synapomorphies, or derived characteristics, for comparison, and 2. Creation of exclusively monophyletic groups in taxonomies. For those who don't know or don't remember, synapomorphy is a trait of an ancestor that is present in many or all of its descendants. Not all, because a trait can be lost somewhere down the line. For example, snakes are still considered tetrapods despite no longer having limbs. And a monophyletic group is a group that includes the ancestors with all of its descendants, even if that ancestor is no longer extant. This system was called cladism. The different approaches fought viciously with each other for years. I highly recommend the paper titled, and I'm not making this up, 50 Shades of Cladism by A.V. Brower. It goes into both the history and the philosophy behind the approaches and summarizes their best arguments. A little spoiler for the title though, because cladism won. The cladist rules of only true group as a monophyletic group is the reason why there is no longer such thing as a fish and why birds are considered dinosaurs. A monophyletic group must include all of its descendants. Birds are descendants of dinosaurs, and dinosaur is the higher level taxon, ergo all birds are dinosaurs. A group of fish called teleosts has as one of its descendants vertebrates. So either we're all fishes or the category of fish does not make any sense. Cladistics applies these rules because it wants phylogenetic trees to reflect natural categories. Here's the thing though. What the hell is a natural category? The next bit of drama in the story arrives in 1977, when a guy named Carl Woese announces his discovery of a third fundamental taxon of life, Archaea. Before the study, the whole living world was split into prokaryotes, which included only bacteria, and eukaryotes, so everything else. Woese, using molecular genetic tools, demonstrated that there were in fact two different kinds of prokaryotes, differing by a very basic genetic trait, the composition of ribosomes. This was already strange enough, but what's more, Archaea were actually more closely related to eukaryotes than bacteria to eukaryotes. Considering that most species of Archaea are extremophiles that have very little in common with eukaryotes and live in, for example, deep ocean hydrothermal vents, this put in doubt the feasibility of establishing any sort of accurate evolutionary relationship based on phenotypic traits alone. To make matters worse, soon after the discovery of Archaea, another incredibly important finding was published: arguments in favor of endosymbiosis of mitochondria and plastids. The scientist who made the discovery, Lynn Margulis, actually despised Woese, even though she used similar methods in molecular genetics. One of the core arguments for endosymbiosis theory is the presence of DNA in mitochondria and plastids and their independent replication and protein synthesis. We now understand that an eukaryote is probably a combination of an archaea and a bacteria that it absorbed, and that endosymbiosis events are not so rare in nature, especially among single-celled eukaryotes who sometimes show signs of multiple absorptions. For example, there are protists that have multiple nuclei of different content, one presumably belonging to an organism they assimilated a long time ago. Now, this was already more than enough to cause quite a noise in evolutionary biology and cladistics. Both the discovery of archaea and in the symbiosis theory were heavily criticized and took a long time to be accepted, partially because the use of molecular genetic tools was very new at that point, and partially because Woese and Margulis were exceptionally stubborn people who did not like their authority questioned and were not so strict on some rules of scientific conduct, such as having your findings peer-reviewed before announcing it in regular newspapers. I'm looking at you, Woese. Of course, eventually science had to admit that they did have a point. I wonder what Woese and Margulis thought about later discoveries, such as the fact that the majority of the human genome is composed of trash and viral DNA, or that a viral protein actually plays a key role in the development of the placenta, a synapomorphy of all placental mammals. So really, if you think about it, animals like humans are part archaea, part bacteria, part virus, and are also simultaneously fishes and reptiles. Now throw in introgression for fun, the process of gene exchange between different species, and we are in trouble. What is a species in the first place? We have no single agreed upon definition, since all of them have some sort of flaw in the premise. Species can exchange genes and merge and be established in one generation by a polyploidy event. Molecular genetics continues to complicate the picture by finding similarities between taxonomic groups we would never think to put together, such as whales and horses. And my own personal experience shows that even genetic tools are not all universally reliable, since they can produce wildly different phylogenetic trees depending on which parts of the genome you use or how you sample the population. Where are your natural categories now, cladistics? Where are they? Huh?
Part 3, is a hot dog a sandwich?
I want to start this part with clarifying that I'm not making any sort of revolutionary argument in here. Like, science is very much aware that scientific models are best current approximations, and that every attempt to describe the enormous complexity of the universe in words of mathematics will result in simplifications of some sort. Creating species categories in evolutionary trees is similar to making flat maps of a round planet. Something along the lines is bound to be distorted. Philosophy of science is very comfortable with these ambiguities, and fields that remain squishier than others usually embrace it instead of denying it. Cladists do argue among themselves about their rules. For example, they often bring up that whether a group counts as monophyletic or not depends on which part of the tree is considered the ancestor. You can make a circle here or here or here and get 3 different answers of what kind of group it is. Even worse than that, what we see in the natural world, either as extant animals or fossils, are blurry snapshots of a moving picture. From the point of view of evolution, a current population is a fraction of a frame in a single second, and it is very hard to make accurate judgments based on the static approximations of dynamic and rapidly changing systems. And again, these are all well-known issues. I'm not criticizing anyone, I just find it fascinating how truly fuzzy biology is when you examine it closely. Starting from the most basic biological question there is: what is life?
Baby, don't hurt me.
We already run into problems. To this day, there are no single-sentence definitions of living things that all biologists accept. High school textbooks usually list a bunch of traits, a kind of checklist you can use to determine whether something is alive or not. We're talking things like the presence of cells and DNA, metabolism, ability to procreate, and so on. How many of those traits we require to classify something as living really matters. For example, some viruses, such as giant viruses, appear to tick off a decent amount of the criteria, yet classifying them as living is highly controversial. There is also no agreement on whether giant viruses are descendants of independent cells that lost a bunch of their molecular machinery, or just really big viruses that kleptomaniaced their way into sort of livinghood. Also, what about alien life? What about prions? Is fire a living thing if it can grow, procreate, and sustain itself? I want answers, goddammit. Want something even more confusing? biological sex. I'm not even talking about mushrooms here that can have hundreds of mating types, or weird in-between gametes that some eukaryotes have. I'm talking like vertebrates, things that you would think are more or less binary when it comes to sex. But no, we've got fishes that switch sexes and parthenogenetic lesbian lizards and lionesses with manes. No one has it figured out. Not even humans. Like, you'd think mammals would be fairly boring when it comes to biological sex, considering we have genomic imprinting and sex-determining chromosomes, and often enough at least some amount of secondary sex characteristics. And yet it is impossible to pick any single trait that separates human males from human females. Is it chromosomes? Well, there's plenty of intersex people, up to 2% of the population. There are cisgender, assigned female at birth women with XY chromosomes, who usually don't find out they have no uterus until late into puberty. There are also cisgender, assigned male at birth men with XX chromosomes who might not find out about it at all, since the only thing that makes them different from an average XY cis male is being infertile. And then there are people with all kinds of combinations, X0, XXY, XYY, XXX. I could keep going. Fertility, or which gametes you produce, is no good measure either, even though it's the one commonly used in evolutionary biology. Plenty of people don't produce any gametes and yet are still medically considered either male or female. Almost every aspect of sex-related biology, gametes, gonads, genitals, hormone levels, secondary sex characteristics, can be mixed and matched in people however you please. Once again, best we can do is a checklist of traits. But who decides which traits are important? Who decides how many you have to tick off the list to be considered a man or a woman? The issue of criteria setting is especially visible when it comes to our classification of disorders, and especially of psychiatric disorders. There's plenty of fuzziness in medicine in general, but psychiatry is particularly prone to it due to a lack of highly objective tests. For the most part, diagnosis is done based on interviews and conversations, with some questionnaires thrown in for good measure. It is quite common to be diagnosed based on a literal checklist of symptoms, such as those presented in the DSM or the ICD. Because of this, the authority compiling these checklists has enormous influence on, quite literally, what does and what does not count as a disorder. For example, by simply exchanging the word "or" for "and" in one line of diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, the DSM authors are hoping to drive down the rate of diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder. Think about this for a second. By replacing one word, they have the power to change someone's diagnostic label. What does this mean, philosophically or practically? Does a person stop being autistic the minute this change comes into effect, because they used to fulfill the criteria but no longer will once the criteria is edited? Can someone be both autistic and not autistic, depending on whether the doctor uses the DSM or the ICD? Is it even possible to define a developmental neurotype as complex and diverse as autism by a short set of criteria? Now, we have to agree that the traits we are trying to describe here are real, tangible things. An ant is different from a rock, an average male is different from an average female, and autistic traits clearly exist. My middle school bullies can confirm me on that last one. However, we also have to agree that the categorization of these very real traits is arbitrary and socially constructed. An ant and a human male exist independently of our ideas, but the words ant and male are artificial constructs. They are made and defined and controlled by us, our opinions and discoveries and perceptions, and that's why they can change and are changing all the time. Furthermore, none of these categories, a living thing, a male, an autistic person, occur in rigid sets of traits that are mutually exclusive. All of them are malleable, overlapping, and fuzzy. Like the good old normal distribution tells us, in biology, there is always someone that exists on the margins and fucks up all of your definitions. These categories, soft, fuzzy, and interconnected, are very difficult to study with the logical and mathematical scientific method. Hard sciences don't like them. Scientists are kind of scared of them sometimes. But the issue is, In order to study them, to talk about them and understand them, we have to categorize them. Remember, naming is categorizing, and we have to have a name to talk about it. Navigation requires a map, even if it is a distorted 2D map of a round planet. Science itself is a necessary simplification. Every scientific model is an increasingly detailed and truthful sketch of an infinitely more detailed reality. And we have to keep in mind that even with the best tools, we may never be able to grasp this reality. We can only approximate and constantly improve our models. These questions of categorization matter though. They matter for research, phylogenetic effects, evolutionary biology and zoology, and conservation and genetics and so much more. They matter for the world, for psychiatry, for human rights, for everyday interactions. Placing something into a category changes our perception of that thing. There's countless psychological research on it. We cannot avoid categorization, and we cannot avoid being affected by categorization, so we have to talk about it. And perhaps as scientists, we sometimes try too hard to separate ourselves from philosophy and humanities. Part of it is the obsession with practical, result-oriented, productive research, because this is what gets us grants, that's what keeps our jobs. I know, it's a huge systemic issue that you cannot possibly tackle on your own. So may I interest you in some academic unions, perhaps? The other part, I think, is a discomfort with the fuzzy and the unknown. I feel like a lot of people in science have this lingering aversion to uncertainty, even after years of doing research. We want things to be clear and decisive, like an exam result in undergrad. We want it to be definitive, objective, scientific. Makes sense, I guess, fear of the unknown is very old and powerful, but maybe it is good to sit with that discomfort and adjust our expectations and embrace the fuzziness. Because it's not going anywhere, and we'll have to learn to live with it. So, to answer the question that has probably been on your mind for a while, I think whether a hot dog is a sandwich depends on the use of the categorization system. I love these purist rebel memes because it shows how having to state your criteria of a category can lead to interesting conclusions. Now, if we're talking aisles in a supermarket, I feel like it makes sense to put hot dogs under sandwiches, but in a restaurant, man, I don't know. Probably you need to display a lower taxon of edible produce. I don't know what I'm even saying at this point. Anyway, I think hot dog is a sandwich in the same way that a snake is a tetrapod, and I will die on this hill. And yes, of course, phylogenetics is a real science, Betterage's law. For me, what makes a science is the commitment to the scientific method, not any sort of practical result or appearance. I am curious where it will go over the next few decades though, and whether it will reinvent itself again. I kinda like the idea of overlapping circles, or something like peaks and valleys maybe, with paths in between them. I don't know, I think we need something that reflects the squishiness of evolution and species concepts. Something worthy of the messy, ridiculous world that is the biosphere. And remember kids, it is good and useful to ask questions just for the sake of curiosity. Fundamental science is fun and necessary, and so is philosophy and humanities and art. Because where else can you find this much joy, if not in creativity and discovery? If you're still watching this, that probably means that you're currently tied to a chair in the basement of my evil science lab. Thank you for your sacrifice to biology. Next I'm going to turn you into a crab. Carcinization, baby. So, it's been a while. I kinda burned out on the whole YouTube thing. And like, creativity in general, I guess. I'm not entirely over it, to be honest, but if I posted this, well, that's a good first step. I know this topic is not particularly in line with my previous stuff. I'm trying out some new things and just writing scripts about whatever I find interesting or important in the moment. I hope you will stay with me on this journey. Like, hey, subscribing and staying subscribed is free, so might as well give me some reason to keep typing. And you know the drill, the likes and comments are great, and sharing the link is even better. All citations are in the descriptions or in the Google Docs. I don't know, I haven't decided yet. Either way, you will find them. If you have a few dollars to spare to support me buying Monster Energy drink and makeup, I have a coffee link in the description. Thank you for sticking around and feeding your curiosity. Cheers.